It was after 2 a.m. this morning when the Senate finally passed this historic measure, which puts the fiscal cliff behind us if the House of Representatives follows through and passes it as well. I hope that they take it up today or as quickly as possible and pass it with the same bipartisan spirit and vote that we saw on the floor of the United States Senate last night. If I'm not mistaken, the final vote was 89-8, which was a significant bipartisan vote. It was a moment of high emotion in the Senate for several reasons. First, on a personal level, many of our colleagues were casting their final vote as United States Senators. Those who were leaving the Senate gathered in the well here, and we wished them the best. But it was also a moment of high emotion because I can't think of another vote in recent time that the American people have followed so closely. I couldn't sit down on an airplane or at a restaurant in Chicago without having somebody come up to me and say, "What's going to happen?" They were very concerned, as they should have been, because the so-called fiscal cliff is a threat to our economic recovery, and one that I believe finally mobilized on a bipartisan basis the majority necessary to pass this measure in the Senate. The President showed extraordinary leadership on this matter. I know that he was personally invested in it, thought about it long and hard, left his family vacation, which he looks forward to, and even more so after the campaign, to come back to Washington and try to put together a solution to this fiscal crisis. He was successful in the Senate, and I hope he will be in the House as well. He had the able efforts of his Vice President, Joe Biden, as well, to help in this effort. Last night, Vice President Biden came back to his home, the United States Senate, where he served for 36 years, and spoke to the Senate Democrats about the importance of this vote. It was almost an hour and a half on New Year's Eve, somewhat surreal, as we gathered some away from their spouses for the first time in decades for this important vote. And for an hour and a half, we spoke and asked questions of the Vice President and expressed our feelings. And you could sense during the course of that meeting an emerging consensus among the Democratic senators. In the end, there were all but 3 of the Democratic senators who voted in favor of this measure. There are parts of it that many of us disagree with, even today, but we understand that is the nature of compromise, that part of what you have to accept may not be popular with you, but you have to be willing to compromise to solve problems. When we look at the issues that were before us, I think we made some significant progress. The most significant progress was to protect 99% of American families from any tax increase. If the Senate measure is approved in the House, we will see 99% of American families spared a tax increase today. Now, the vast majority of working families, middle-income families, struggle. They live check to paycheck. The Pew Institute did a survey within the last year or two asking working families a very basic question. If an emergency came up, could you find $2,000, borrow or find $2,000 to meet an emergency need? $2,000 is not an extraordinary amount of money when you consider that a simple trip to emergency room or an urgent care clinic could result in a $2,000 medical bill. Well, they asked working families. Barely half of American families had access to $2,000. And that tells you how close to the edge so many families live. Had we not acted on this measure early this morning, these middle-income families would have faced an increase in their taxes of more than $2,000 a year. That's not only in Illinois and California, but across the nation. So we had to come together and protect those families, and that was the starting point for the President's position on this issue and the starting point for the Democrats. We passed 6 months ago in this chamber a measure which would have protected these families. We sent it to the House. They never called it, and we had to renew our efforts last night. And successfully, we were able to achieve that by the end of the evening. We had to bargain, as usual, in the political atmosphere, and had to raise the exemption from $250,000 of family income to $450,000 of family income. But In so doing, we have protected working families from this tax increase which otherwise would have taken place. These families need the resources to not only meet the bills that they face each month, but to try to save a little bit for the future, for their families and for some of their own dreams about a better life. So that was the important first step in this package that was passed early this morning. The other thing that was part of it was a 5-year extension. I wish it had been permanent, but a 5-year extension on the Earned Income Tax Credit. Earned Income Tax Credit is a measure passed during the Reagan administration, which said that we would give working families a tax benefit for working, Earned Income Tax Credit. And that is probably, as President Reagan described it, the best way to eliminate and reduce poverty in our nation. So the Earned Income Tax Credit has been extended for 5 years. The Child Tax Credit, which does exactly what it says to families with children, we will give you a tax credit to help you raise those children. That too was renewed for another 5 years. And a provision in the law which was added by Senator Schumer of New York years ago, which helps working families to pay for college education. That too was included in this measure. So from a working family perspective, there were many good and important elements that were included in this measure. We also considered a lot of other tax measures, some of which I liked and some I didn't like. One of them in particular, the estate tax, is a tax that is widely misunderstood. This is a tax which applies to the very, very small fraction of a percentage of American families that when the breadwinner passes away, have a valuable estate that can be subject to federal taxation. It is a very small percentage. Some 3% might be affected by an estate tax, and at the higher levels that we've discussed in our debate on this issue, less than 1% of estates end up paying any tax whatsoever to the federal government. The Republicans insisted on a provision which Senator Kyle of Arizona had been championing for years, which would raise the exemption for estates to over $5 million, which means a $5.1 million estate would not be subject to any taxation, and over that amount, subject to a 40% tax responsibility. I personally think that it should have been a lower figure. We're dealing with the wealthiest people in America again, and many of them make plans, estate planning, to avoid this tax throughout their lives. And it turns out that fewer than half of 1% of those who use this benefit are actually small businesses and farmers. Most of them are very wealthy people who have done well. I can think of a friend of mine in central Illinois. Her father was a farmer and started with very modest means, bought some land, and over time the land has mushroomed in value and to the point where his estate is worth multi-millions of dollars. She will have an estate that is huge, far beyond what she could imagine, and she would be subject to this tax. She is not a farmer. I don't think has ever been on a tractor unless she did as a child. And it is an asset which would be subject to the estate tax. So we reached an agreement, albeit a reluctant agreement, to establish this estate tax of exemption of $5.1 million, subject to a tax beyond that of 40%. There were many other provisions related to the tax code, some of them very esoteric, but that was an important starting point here, protecting working families, protecting the deductions and credits they need the most, and making certain that we have revenue coming in from this. We anticipate some $600 billion in new revenue coming in to help reduce our deficit as a result of this. We also have something in the law which the presiding officer and I talked about for a moment, the alternative minimum tax. There was a time when they took a look at America and said, how can this possibly be that some of the wealthiest people pay no taxes? So we established something called an alternative minimum tax, which said even if under the regular tax code you escape all tax liability, you are going to be subject to the alternative minimum tax where you will pay something. Well, it wasn't a bad idea 30 or 40 years ago when the debate started, but because we didn't index the income that was associated with it, over the years, this alternative minimum tax hit not only the wealthy, but started hitting those in middle income categories. So each year we had to kind of postpone the impact of this tax on middle income families. Let's say families in the $100,000 to $200,000 range. This has been vexing us for decades. And last night in the Senate, or this morning in the Senate, with the passage of this legislation, we have dealt with the problem once and for all. We have a permanent fix on the alternative minimum tax. It is something that I'm sure most American families are probably puzzled over, but it's an important element, and getting this behind us was critically important as well. We also managed to extend the doc fix. What is that all about? Over 10 years ago, we said we're going to save some money in Medicare. We're just going to take a little percentage cut each year in how much we would pay doctors and hospitals who treat Medicare patients. Therefore, we'll reduce the cost of Medicare and be done with it. Well, guess what? We had a great idea, but when it came to imposing the law, the doctors and hospitals pushed back and said, wait a minute, we need this compensation for our care of Medicare patients. And therefore, we postponed it. And every year we postponed it, what we were supposed to save, we had to come up with from other sources. The so-called doc fix, SGR, is another one, like the alternative minimum tax, which has haunted us as we've done these budgets year in and year out. We didn't solve this problem permanently. We solved it for 1 year. Otherwise, what would have happened is, starting today, doctors and hospitals would have seen a reduction in their government reimbursement for treating patients of over 25%. And the net result would have been in Springfield and Chicago, Illinois, and across the nation, in Ohio and California, many doctors and hospitals would have said, we can no longer afford to treat these patients. And the people, the 40 million plus Americans who depend on Medicare, would have had fewer choices for treatment. So we've resolved that issue in the early morning hours with this vote. For 1 year, we have solved that problem. Another thing we've done, which is critically important, is extend unemployment benefits for 1 year. 2 million Americans, 2 million, would have lost their unemployment benefits this morning as a result of this so-called fiscal cliff if we had not taken action. I can tell you that it means an awful lot in my state of Illinois. As I mentioned, 2 million on a statewide, nationwide basis. But we also have literally tens of thousands in my own state that face the same basic problem. These are people who've been out of work for a long time. Some of them are in school, some are taking courses for retraining, all are trying to keep their family together, not lose their home while they're unemployed. So the extension of these unemployment benefits was the president's second highest priority after protecting middle-income Americans, and it is included in this package. It's an important element. One last point, when you ask the Congressional Budget Office, if you had to spend one tax dollar to help the economy, where would you spend it? They will tell you over and over again, it's clear, unemployment benefits. The dollar that you spend on unemployment benefits goes directly back into the economy. These people aren't salting it away for a rainy day. They aren't investing it. They're spending it on goods and services to get by. Utility bills and rent and mortgage payments and food and clothing, the basics of life. And as they spend it back into the economy, it is respent. So each dollar has kind of a multiplier effect behind it of $1.60 ultimately into the economy. So not only the humane and right thing to do for those who are out of work and struggling, but also a good thing for boosting economic growth. That's an important part. One of the real disappointments last night, and I have to tell you, it really is sad that it's come to this, relates to the Farm Bill. We have chairman of the Agriculture Committee in the Senate, Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan, and past chairmen who are serving here all acknowledge, as we do, she's done such an extraordinary job. Her leadership in constructing a farm bill this year really was masterful. I've been around Congress for 30 years, House and the Senate. You can pick out the real legislators, and Debbie Stabenow is a real legislator. She sat down and crafted a farm bill. Now, you may not think of Michigan as a farm state. It is. And she looked at this bill in terms of its entirety. And in its entirety, the farm bill is about more than farmers and ranchers. It's also about nutrition and food programs and school lunch and food stamps. They're all included in this bill. So she tackled it with the ranking Republican member, Pat Roberts of Kansas, and really came up with an amazing work product. She had over 63 votes in the Senate for this farm bill, bipartisan support for this farm bill. And let me tell you what it did. It not only ended up with a bill that had the support of every major farm organization, which is no mean feat, it saved over $23 billion in deficit reduction in 5 years. She went after some of the indefensible programs, like the direct payment program to farmers, which they readily acknowledged needed to go away, took those programs aside and put the money to deficit reduction. She went to the nutrition programs, which are critically important in a struggling economy with families facing income inequality, and she protected those. Those are important to me, and I worked with her, and we came up with, I think, an honest, balanced approach when it came to nutrition programs. We passed the bill. We passed it months ago in the Senate, and we sent it to the House of Representatives. They not only could not pass their own farm bill, never did, but they wouldn't even consider calling the bill that the Senate, the bipartisan Senate bill. Now, the farm organizations were begging them, call it. We need a 5-year program on farming. They wouldn't do it, never did it. And so there was a lot of frustration over here that we did good work on a bill, the House could not put a bill on the floor and wouldn't take our bill up. The thing that brought it together, incidentally, at the last minute, why it was included in this emergency package, it turns out that under the law, if you don't pass a new farm bill, you revert to the 1949 Farm Bill. Talk about going back in history and picking up a law which has little application to today's world. That's what happens. And one particular issue jumped off the page, dairy support. Now, last night I bid farewell to Senator Herb Kohl of Wisconsin. I'm gonna miss him more than most people can imagine, because Herb Kohl spent the time and understood America's dairy program. Madam President, I confess, I don't understand this program. Vaguely, yes, but if it was on the final, I'd flunk. So I used to go to dairy issues, to Senator Kohl. Wisconsin dairy farmers and Illinois dairy farmers always saw eye to eye. I said, Herb, you're my dairy expert. You tell me, you're my advisor. Well, Herb's retiring. I'll need a new advisor. But we found out that if we had not passed a new farm bill and reverted to the 1949 dairy program, the price of milk would double to $10 a gallon. And that, to me, was unacceptable to the White House. And as a result, we had to come through with an emergency measure to avoid that possibility. We should have taken the bipartisan Senate Farm Bill. Senator Stabenow begged for us to do this, could not get that into the negotiation. And I'll say one thing that really, really disappointed me last night. At the last minute, they had one aspect of the dairy program that they needed to take care of. It cost some $60 million to $100 million. We needed to find a pay-for, and unfortunately, the other side of the aisle insisted that the pay-for this dairy support come from the federal food stamp program. That's sad. We had so much waste in our agriculture programs that we identified in our farm bill. And the fact that they would turn to the federal food stamp program, the SNAP program, to come up with this money, to me, is really difficult to understand, explain, or defend. I'm really saddened by that. I guarantee you we will return to that. So, Madam President, what we did in the early morning hours is important for us. It isn't the end of the story. There's more that we will face. In 60 days, if we don't take care, we're going to face another cliff of our own making. Because in 60 days, 3 things come together. The debt ceiling. What's the debt ceiling? America's mortgage. When we spend money for a war, for the Department of Agriculture, whatever it happens to be, ultimately we borrow 40 cents for every dollar we spend. So every president is forced to renew the mortgage, the debt ceiling of the United States. I think under President Ronald Reagan, it was done over and over again, many times without even a record vote. But now it's become a political hot potato, and in a matter of 60 days or so, we'll face another need to renew America's mortgage. In other words, the full faith and credit of the United States government. And that is going to be contentious, a matter of debate. At the same time, the continuing resolution, our temporary spending bill, expires. At the same time, the sequestration kicks in, which is automatic spending cuts. So we will have in 60 days, if the House follows the Senate lead on the fiscal cliff, another challenge. Let's hope that we've learned a lesson from this one. The American people are sick and tired of incompetence and political posturing and failure of Congress to come together on a bipartisan basis to solve a problem. And they want us to get the problem solved and get this nation moving forward. In the early morning hours in the Senate, we finally achieved it. Should have been done long ago, I understand, but we achieved it. And now I hope the House will do the same, follow the Senate example, and 60 days from now, we can approach this problem in a sober, honest, mature way instead of a partisan fashion. That's what the American people expect. I took a look, incidentally, of the specific impact of this morning's vote on my state of Illinois. And for the record, over 5 million Illinois families will be spared a tax increase under the agreement that we passed in the early morning hours. Many of them, almost all of them, the working families I described earlier. Without an agreement, the average family in Illinois would have faced an increase in taxes of more than $2,000. 500,000 families in my state will continue to receive college tuition tax credits, making it easier to send their kids to college. As much as $1,000 of assistance each year, which I'm sure is a helping hand. 1.5 million Illinois families raising children will continue to benefit from the child tax credit, a yearly savings of about $1,000 on average for each of these Illinois families with kids. Working families in Illinois will continue to receive the Earned Income Tax Credit. Over 230,000 Illinois families benefited from that tax credit last year. More than 1 million Illinois taxpayers are protected from an increase in taxes under the alternative minimum tax, which I mentioned to you earlier. Thousands of Illinois children will continue to have access to school readiness programs like Head Start. Low-income families will continue to benefit from low-income home energy programs, LIHEAP. The agreement protects funding for nutrition assistance for women, infants, and children, prenatal care so that we can have more healthy babies and healthy moms. The elderly, disabled, low-income families, and veterans will continue to receive housing assistance. Over 88,000 Illinoisans will continue to receive the unemployment benefits that I mentioned earlier, and Illinois businesses will benefit from more than $8.5 billion in consumer spending by middle-class families spending more on goods and services at a time when we desperately need this in our economy. Let me say one last word. I've been involved in this deficit discussion for a long period of time. This is not a deficit reduction measure, period. It does reduce it in some aspects, but the arcane scoring by the Congressional Budget Office will not give us any credit for reducing the deficit. We do have more revenue coming in toward deficit reduction, but some of the other measures I mentioned would be scored as expenditures. Having said that, we still have a deficit issue. We still have a deficit problem. What we tried to establish this morning in this vote, revenue has to be part of every solution on deficit reduction. The other side of the aisle reluctantly, after years of resisting it, came to our side in the early morning hours. That's number one. Number two, we need to take an honest look at entitlements. Here's what the facts are. Social Security, untouched, unamended, unchanged, will make every promised payment for 20 years. You can't say that about any other federal program. 20 years of payments with cost of living adjustments every single year. And on the 21st year, there'll be a drop-off of 30% in terms of Social Security benefits. So we have 20 years. We can wait. We can wait 5, 10, or 15 to do something, or we can do it soon, maybe even this year, 2013. That's what I'd like to see. I'm preparing legislation to be introduced shortly, which will call for the creation of a commission with a very simple assignment. Come up with a plan for 75-year solvency of Social Security. And when you have it, and it's been certified to be a valid plan, report it to Congress to be considered without debate. I shouldn't say without debate, without filibuster, without delay. And when it comes to the floor, any member who can offer a substitute amendment that achieves 75-year solvency can also call their measure at the same time. Let us have this chance to have this debate and to make sure we have solvency for Social Security that will affect not only all of our lives, but the lives of our children and beyond. That, to me, is a responsible thing to do. Medicare, much tougher. Medicare goes broke in 12 years. 12 years. Why? Well, because, lo and behold, today, 10,000 Americans reach the age of 65. 10,000 reach that same age yesterday and tomorrow. And for the next 18 years, the baby boomers have arrived. We knew it was coming, but as they show up, their demands for services that they've paid for and invested in throughout their working lives are going to continue to grow. Those people who say there's too much government spending, we got to stop the government spending, I really want to ask them, so are you going to say to the millions of Americans who paid into Social Security for a lifetime, paid into Medicare for a lifetime, that we're going to walk away from our obligations? Of course not. What we have to do on Medicare is find a way to meet this growing population with demands and the mushrooming costs of health care. We can do it. There are ways to save money, humane ways to save money, and protect the integrity and future of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I think that the President's Obamacare, as it's been characterized, or Affordable Health Care Act, is a step in that direction. But we need to do more when it comes to Medicare.
This has been a Sunfish production.